I'm Dr. Libby O'Connell. I have a PhD in early American history, which I got at the University of Virginia, as a matter of fact. I worked for 22 years as an historian at the History Channel, and now I'm the chief historian emeritus, and I write about food, history, and culture. Southern food is a braid. You think of a braid having three strands, and one strand is the Native American culture, another strand is African, and the third strand is the English culture. And it gets closely woven together so that you can hardly pull it apart. I first became interested in culinary history when I was working at Plymouth Plantation. I took a semester off from college and I worked in costume as an interpreter. My job was doing open hearth cooking, and I also tended the herb garden and did dairy, milking the cow and helping to make butter and cream and stuff like that, skim the milk. I grew up in a household where my mother had never cooked. My grandmother did not cook. No females cooked. They were all intellectuals and had no interest in cooking. My mother made sure we had nutritious meals, sort of more or less on time, but she was not interested in that. But we spent a lot of time in Europe growing up. My father was a European history professor, and so I was exposed to really good food at an early age, at a time when most Americans were still eating iceberg lettuce and Wonder Bread with bologna. And so I loved that food. And when I was 9 years old, I said, I'm going to make creme caramel, which is a very common everyday dessert in France. And I did. And after that, it was such a success. I was so pleased with the family response to homemade creme caramel that I went on to just think cookbooks were something that I could do. Once I learned I knew how to read, no reason why I couldn't cook. One of the fun ways to learn about history of food that I found was study the word origins. So for example, the language that's spoken by a lot of the Native Americans in the West Indies is Taino. They were Taino Indians, they spoke Taino. And they had nouns in their vocabulary for words that the Spanish had never heard of, for things that the Spanish had never heard of. Things like hammocks, or hurricanes, or tobacco, or tomato, or jerky, all of these words. And one of them is maize. The Spanish had never seen corn before, what we call corn. They didn't know what it was called, so they said, through an interpreter, what do you call this? And the Taino said maize. So many of the oldest American simple words that define something that's part of the American experience are from this Native American language. And maize is what we should be calling corn. I used to work as a part-time history professor at Long Island University, and someone suggested I send in my resume to A&E, that they were starting a new channel on history. And at first I thought, I'm not interested in television, but then I thought, why not? Let's take a chance. So I left teaching for 6 months. I said, I'll be back after the end of the semester in the fall, I'll be back. And actually I got the job as a consultant for A&E, and eventually I was hired as the historian in residence, and then I became the chief historian. So I was the chief historian for the History Channel for many, many years, and it was a really great gig. One of the things that I learned very early in my career was at Plymouth Plantation, where I was working in the kitchen in costume, is that people sometimes would get that kind of vague time to go look if you just talked about straightforward history. But if you talked about the history of food, everybody was interested. Because why? They eat food every day. Food is something that we all have a contact with. So one of the things I enjoy doing is telling stories based around food and using food as a lens for understanding the past. And it's just something I find really enthralling. You learn fun things, you learn exciting things. You also can learn a lot about tragedies and the real parts of history. It's not all fun, but it is always interesting, and food can take you there. I came to write The American Plate later than I had hoped, but I was trained to make my first book about my PhD dissertation. And my PhD dissertation was about changes in law and the court system from England to Virginia in the first half of the 17th century. And I really loved that topic, but for some reason, the longer I spent away from graduate school, the more clear it was to me that that was a book that was never going to happen. I just could not go back to that. And I loved the history of food. So I tried to keep I've got to publish my dissertation before I do my next book. Never did it. Did publish a book about the history of food because it's something that I think of as a way to bring people under the tent of understanding history. I'm a public historian, and I explain it to people this way. When you travel to a country, you're going to go to the marketplace, you're going to go to the museums, maybe the galleries, you're going to walk through the city streets, and you're going to try the food, because the food is part of culture. So if we study culture in all of these institutions, why wouldn't we study the culture of the table? That can tell you the stories of a whole different type, the story of private life in that country, or even the feasting and celebration times. How different classes interacted, how genders interacted. All of these things come together when you study the history of food. So to me, it's one of the best lenses on the past because it's so inclusive. And as a public historian, that's one of my goals, is to bring people out of academia into the sense of culture and taste and this sort of intellectual nutrition that the history of food can provide. People ask me, what is history? And I always answer, history is change over time. And there are lots of ways of understanding that change. Food is a good way of understanding change over time. It's not static. And you can go back to recreating recipes, which I've done, to learn about how people were eating and what utensils they used and how long it took to cook some of those dishes. But it's always changing, and it's hard to put an exact pin in any moment in history, just the way our lives are always changing.